Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 13th, 2022. There have been some ominous developments in the last days which are bringing us to the brink of World War III. And this is the assessment of people such as acclaimed Russian scholar Gilbert Doctorow, Ray McGovern, Helga Zepp-LaRouche from the Schiller Institute. The danger is growing as a result of the so-called counteroffensive of the Ukrainian forces that are pushing back the Russians from the Kharkiv region. Now, essentially what we know is there's been heavy fighting, there have been heavy casualties on both sides, and the Russian forces have moved back and Ukraine has recaptured a certain amount of territory. But it's not clear yet whether the Ukrainians will be able to sustain this counteroffensive and what the Russian response will be. What we do know is that the impetus for this was escalated around the Ramstein Air Base meeting in Germany on September 9th, where Defense Secretary from Raytheon, Lloyd Austin, was there along with a number of other NATO officials. There were pledges made for more weapons, including sophisticated precision-guided missiles, including some which are guided by GPS systems and are targeting Russian radar, among other things. The request was also made for more weapons as Zelensky continues his demand that the West provide more to Ukraine, more powerful, more sophisticated weapons. There's talk of U.S. NATO coordination of the Ukrainian offensive, including from intelligence side, but also planning for the military operations. Polish tanks, or they're Polish soldiers? We don't know. Meanwhile, Blinken and Nuland were in Kiev, as was Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, for talks of how to continue the offensive and how to proceed, and also a lot of cheerleading coming from the Western press. So it's not clear whether this offensive can be sustained, but more importantly is the danger of World War III coming from this. It's clear this is no longer a proxy war. It now has become a war of NATO against Russia. And there's a push from some in Russia to drop the constraints, to do more to damage civilian infrastructure, for example, hitting rail lines, hitting power stations, strikes against Kiev and government ministries, including the president. Now, this is all occurring with little or no pushback from an anti-war movement in the West. And it's clear that this is largely due to the fact that there's censorship. There's little public debate allowed. If you call for an end to the war, you're labeled a Russian propagandist. If you call for negotiations, if you call for an end to the shipment of weapons, you're essentially called an appeaser of Putin. This is extremely dangerous because people are not able to participate in a discussion as to what the future will be. In fact, in Europe, I would say people are paralyzed by fear, including fears of a no heat, no eat winter. Then you have lunatics running around like Anna Applebaum of the Atlantic Council and the Washington Post saying, in a hyped up way, like an athlete on adrenaline, go for victory, get rid of Putin now. Now, at the same time, you have responses coming from Russia, like the Russian ambassador in Berlin, who said the weapon shipments from Germany to Ukraine have crossed a red line because they are now killing civilians in the Donbass. Now, with all the focus on the military and on the conflict in Ukraine, keep in mind this is a much bigger issue than Ukraine. The attempt to keep it focused on Ukraine is to take your eyes off this bigger picture. And what's the bigger picture? The collapse of the unipolar order, which is based on control of the financial system by Western banks backed up by NATO. There's a financial disintegration going on along with an economic collapse. And there's an attempt to defend the unipolar order through military force and defeating potential adversaries. Now, it's not only kinetic warfare, but also so-called hybrid warfare, what used to be known as psychological warfare, to control the discussion and to disorient potential adversaries. Now, what's the ultimate goal of those behind this NATO war? It has nothing to do with Ukrainian freedom. And I hate to say this to my friends in Ukraine, but they're not interested in your well-being and your sovereignty and your security. In fact, they're preparing to carve you up after the war, as we already see with Zelensky making available some of the best Ukrainian farmland to Western cartels, including financial predators such as BlackRock and Vanguard, and corporate cartels such as Archer Daniels, Midland, and Cargill. So, and meanwhile, you're being loaded up with debt for the weapons that are being delivered. The future for Ukraine, even if Ukraine were to win this war, would be to go under the kind of austere International Monetary Fund conditionalities, which are responsible for the decline in living standards of Ukraine from 1991 to 2014, and then the escalated decline after the Maidan coup in 2014. The long-range goal, as I said, is not to secure economic prosperity for Ukraine, but to maintain the power of the unipolar forces centered in the City of London and Wall Street. And their goal is to use this for the Great Reset. This is the City of London, the way they're attempting to sustain their power. The front man for this is the new King of England, King Charles III, who's been promoting this policy since the early 2000s, who's a close collaborator of Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, very close collaborator with Mark Carney, who is now the zero growth green czar of the United Nations. And they're working on behalf of the central banks, who are basically owned by private banks that are overloaded with corporate debt, state debt, and personal debt, and can only continue to the extent that they can loot from the population, that is, lower the standard of living, and cut back on industry, agriculture, and physical goods production. Their other concern is to stop the emergence of a new monetary system, which is well underway with the discussions of new financial transaction systems, new trade policies, multilateral agreements that are being reached by such agencies as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS countries, and so on. So these countries are reacting against the green zero growth policy, which is disguised as a protection against man-made climate change, but which is really intended to destroy industry, destroy agriculture, power and food shortages, and austerity, to use austerity, while they still maintain plenty of money for war and bailout of bankrupt corporations. This is why Helga Zepp-LaRouche and the Schiller Institute are calling for a new Bretton Woods, the idea which was introduced many years ago by Lyndon LaRouche to fix the errors of the original Bretton Woods and move toward a mutually cooperative series of agreements for development, economic development, new technologies, new platforms of infrastructure, based on cooperation among sovereign nations. The other side, the City of London side, has been opposed to sovereign nations going back to the post-John F. Kennedy period, where there are numerous articles, books, written about why sovereignty is bad and we need a global corporate supranational government to oversee the actions of individual nations. Instead, we need to proceed on the path toward a new financial and security architecture. And the idea that this can be stopped by pouring weapons into Ukraine and administering defeats to the Russian military is an absolute fantasy. Because if this continues, either World War III could escalate to a nuclear war, But in the meantime, it is increasing the danger, or not the danger, but the potential for a break from this old system. So my advice is don't succumb to spectatoritis. Don't be paralyzed. It's now time to get involved, to mobilize for this new economic system based on the principles of bilateral and multilateral cooperation among sovereign nation states. That's what NATO is designed to stop, is being deployed as global NATO to stop. I'll continue with updates over the next couple of days. In the meantime, you can go to theschillerinstitute.com to see the extensive discussion of these issues that took place at the September 10th and 11th Schiller Institute Conference.